Hello, welcome to the Inside the Birds day after Super Bowl show. That's right, it's the day after the Eagles destroy the Kansas City Chiefs 40-22 in Super Bowl LIX. Jeff Mosher here alongside Adam Kaplan, and we promised we were bringing for the sights and sounds from the Eagles locker room, victorious locker room, Andrew DiCecco. He's still in New Orleans, still getting his work done. He is there. He was in the locker room. He covered the game. Andrew, welcome to the show. Man, last night was crazy. Obviously, trying to do a post-game show at 2 a.m. That probably only would have worked for people on Bourbon Street, but we got you here now. Great job. So let's start this off by, I want you to set the scene for us, because watching at home as the teams get announced, it certainly sounded like a very pro-Eagles crowd at the Superdome, the Caesar Superdome. What percentage would you say was Eagles fans to Chiefs fans there?
Probably, I would say 60-75%. So probably 60%. 60% is more accurate. When the Chiefs players came out, there was a thunderous chorus of boos. When the Eagles came out, everything the Eagles did, even if their pictures were on the jumbotron, there was an eruption of cheers. So, and you got to see that walking through the parking lot, walking around the concourse. There was just a ton of Eagles green. I was trying to do a pregame hit. There's no quiet place to do it. You hear constant Eagles chants as I'm trying to, conduct a phone call. But yeah, it was just one of those things where it just seemed like it was a very heavy Eagles crowd there.
Comparatively to the Super Bowl 2 years ago, from a crowd standpoint, inside the stadium, obviously they were in Arizona 2 years ago, but this year you've got the situation in New Orleans, and also during your time during the week, I definitely noticed more Eagle fans, but I don't think it was overwhelming. It seemed like in Arizona, man, it was just a sea of green. So what are your thoughts on kind of the streets and everything you were doing?
Yeah, I saw a lot of green, but I also saw a mixture of red as well. I just think that Eagles fans, they bring a little bit more juice than maybe Kansas City fans do, because they were loud. And I heard it a lot, especially where I was sitting in the press box. I heard it a lot from those pockets of that part of the stadium. They travel well and they're really loud and they get behind their team. And the Eagles gave them something to cheer for. And I think that also took obviously Kansas City out of the game pretty early, and the Eagles fans just really dominated that.
Was that at all obvious in the first quarter, Andrew, as the Eagles defense really took it to the Chiefs offensive line? Could you feel the crowd, like the momentum? Was the Superdome? I've always thought the Superdome is one of the loudest, if not the loudest, venue in the NFL. Could you feel that as the Eagles were stealing momentum away?
I really did. It was deafening at times, Jeff, and you got the sense that Patrick Mahomes was flustered, and you could see it obviously from a mental standpoint. But physically, it looked like he didn't know which way to go with the football. It looked like he didn't know where the rush was coming from. He looked confounded, and the crowd made it all the more challenging for him and that Kansas City offensive line to iron things out and get on the same page. And that really took shape early on in that game. And I think that when Cooper DeJean had the pick six, that 38-yarder, that's to me where the momentum really shifted.
So, Andrew, from your vantage point, because you get to see like the entire field, was it the left tackle situation, left guard? Was it anything in particular why they look so bad offensively that we're talking about the Chiefs here?
Yeah, I guess you could look at it like that, but it just didn't seem to me that Patrick Mahomes was on his A game. I think that Vic Fangio, in my opinion, Adam, would be the MVP of that game, if not Josh Sweat. I just think that his game plan that he orchestrated against that quarterback and that offense that have a propensity to come back even when they're on the ropes there. I call them the Terminator. And I just think that they've done for Vic to craft a game plan like that. It didn't matter. It didn't matter what their offensive line configuration was. I think the Eagles had a really good answer for it. I'll say this: that whole week that I was around the team, they didn't say it, but they knew they were the better team. You could see how they conducted themselves. You could see the confidence and the swagger. And Nick Sirianni learned a lot from that previous matchup in the Super Bowl. I thought he did a remarkable job in conveying confidence on the podium. Jalen Hurts was all business. I didn't feel for a second they were going to lose that game, especially when you saw them during pregame warmups. The Kansas City Chiefs were out there a lot earlier than the Eagles were. Aside from the specialists, it took a little bit longer for the Eagles to get out there, and it seemed like they wanted to stay off their feet a little bit more. I think Grant Calcaterra was the first player that I really saw that was a position guy, but I just thought that they really handled themselves well.
Andrew, let's talk about the post-game locker. The Eagles win. It must be crazy. I remember in 2017 when they won their first Super Bowl, I had people who had friends who have covered Super Bowls before tell me they'd never seen anything like that in a victorious locker room because that was the first. So the Eagles really let loose. What was this locker room scene like?
So I talked to a couple of our friends that were there for the 2017 celebration, and they said that this one was more epic. There was a lot more going on because it went on longer.
Wow.
So, and I have a story for this ready to go on InsideTheBirds.com because I try to jot down everything that I remembered from that moment because I tried to really paint the picture. So you walk in, you're greeted by premium cigar smoke. My jacket still reeks of cigar smoke. There's music being played. The soundtrack of the evening was Kendrick Lamar and Future. Nolan Smith spraying champagne. James Bradbury standing in his locker with the Oakley goggles on. Jeffrey Lurie's kind of milling around the locker room. You see Howie Roseman getting involved in the music scrum. Different players. You see different photos with your Penn State guys like Saquon Barkley and Jahan Dotson. Jalen Hurts eventually moseys in and he lights up his cigar. And he makes his way around. There's a photo that I have on my X account where he's with Brandon Graham. But if you look closely, Brandon Graham's holding his phone and he's FaceTiming left tackle Jason Peters. So it ended up being like a really epic photo that I was able to capture in that moment. And for Brandon Graham and Darius Slay, they were just kind of just dapping up teammates and just kind of soaking it all in. For the younger players like Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, they were kind of sitting in their lockers, like kind of taking stock on what was going on. Isaiah Rodgers walked down a whole row of lockers, was shaking the hands of everybody who was in there. I just thought it was Will Shipley goes and finds me and gives me a bear hug.
That's awesome.
It's just one of those things where you don't know if you're a younger player if you're going to get back to that moment. And we talked so many times about preparing for moments like that. And as soon as he saw me, he was like, "Yeah, man." He goes, "This is crazy." Some of those moments you never know how someone's going to respond, but I mean that was just a locker room that was it really epitomized how close they've been all year.
Did I hear you say Nolan Smith had his own brand of champagne? Is that
no, I said he was spraying champagne.
Oh, spraying! I think he said his own brand of champagne. I was like, wow, that was fast. But go ahead, Adam.
So one of the things we talked about last year's team, how they were not cohesive. And you've outlined throughout the season how much closer they've gotten. Is there anything that stands out about that closeness that you just could tell? Was it maybe in the spring? At what point do you know that the chemistry was so much better?
That's a great question, Adam, and I apologize for the background noise. Someone's vacuuming in the lobby, but yeah. So I think it was apparent to me in training camp. It was apparent to me when you're seeing the defense prioritize turnovers. You're seeing a lot more structure. You're seeing the communication and the leadership from C.J. Gardner-Johnson and Nakobe Dean. Those two players right there to me were the biggest reasons why that unit was able to elevate from the bottom tier to the NFL's best. But you start to see that come together, and Zach Bond really come into his own. And there was a belief in what they were being taught, what they were being coached. Nick Sirianni's messaging. And obviously early on in the season, there were some hiccups, but they never wavered. In fact, Saquon Barkley was on, I think he was on some interview after the game, and he said, in Philly, we were 2-2 and the sky was falling, but we never felt that. The one thing that I've mentioned to you guys and I mentioned everywhere is that that team exudes a lot of confidence. And I didn't think for 1 second that in a game of that magnitude, they're going to let it slip away again because of the leadership, because of the experience, and they were well aware of how infrequent those opportunities sometimes arise. So, yeah, I just that's training camps really where things started to turn to me that they might have something.
I tell you, if the way a team plays can be personified into a thought, the Eagles played that game like they thought they were going to kick the Chiefs' ass.
Mm-hmm.
They just played like with a supreme level of confidence.
Yeah.
Adam and I talked about how they executed on the highest level at almost every single facet of the game, and then did it with a sort of a vigor that you don't ordinarily see against anyone, let alone the Chiefs.
They knew how good they could be when they were playing at their best level. All three phases of the game working in sync. They knew how explosive and how dynamic they could be as a football team. they didn't really put their best game together to date this season. There's been times where the offense has been great or the defense has had to elevate the offense. Special teams maybe fell short. This was a team effort, and I just think that they were so locked in this week. They didn't deviate too much from their regimen. Nick Sirianni was on point with his messaging. He tweaked a couple of different things from the 2022 Super Bowl experience. And when you have players that speak in front of the team like Saquon Barkley and C.J. Gardner-Johnson, I think there was a good quote that our buddy Tim McManus, he was talking to Sidney Brown, and he said that Sidney Brown, based on what he heard C.J. Gardner-Johnson and Jalen Hurts say, he's like, I knew we weren't losing that game. The night before the game, he said that. And he said Jalen spoke with such emotion. This is Sidney telling Tim this. Sidney spoke with Jalen spoke with such emotion that he said, I don't even know where that came from. But they knew that they weren't going to lose that game.
Wow. Here's one for you. How do you explain Josh Sweat's best game as an Eagle? How do you explain that?
Motivation.
Contract year?
No, I think that certainly played part of it. But the Eagles have done a remarkable job this year, Adam, of finding ways, whether it be midweek or Wednesday or Thursday, to give him the rest day, because he had a ton of energy. He had a ton left in the tank later in the season, whereas last year he played 828 snaps and he had nothing left in the tank. So they were preserving him, and they sort of unleashed him in this game. And I think the Eagles were able to sort of pounce on an undermanned Chiefs offensive line, or I should say overmatched Chiefs offensive line. They didn't really have an answer for him. And Josh was also very effective against the run as well. I should say that. It was 2.5 sacks. He split the one with Jalix Hunt. But I think a lot of it was, he knows that could be his last game and his final audition for another prospective team to maybe bring him in and get that big lucrative free agent deal as well.
Andrew, give me the Jalen Hurts scenes from postgame.
Jalen has the sly smile. He knows what he was capable of. He knows exactly how it was supposed to look like. And as I mentioned, maybe there's national slights on him, not as much locally, but whatever it is, he internalizes that, and he goes out there almost with a chip on his shoulder and handles his business. I thought that he threw the ball with touch, with accuracy. The interception that he threw, he hadn't thrown an interception since November to Trayvon Diggs. He trusted his players. I was probably most impressed with his decision-making and when to run and how to get down, because sometimes when your adrenaline takes over in those big games, it's easy to lose sight of that and put yourself in harm's way. But he was just a cool customer. He was in control the whole game. And after the game, you just saw, I could do this. I had this in me the whole time. We knew what we had here as a team, lighting up a cigar and not really changing who he is and still being committed to the work and knowing that, I'm all about winning. It doesn't matter what it looks like. I don't worry about stats. I don't worry about rushing yards. I don't worry about any of that. I sort of base I put my emphasis on winning.
Did you get an MVP vote, by the way, real quick? Did you get an MVP? I know they give every single press in the main box an MVP vote. No? Okay.
I probably would have voted for Josh Sweat.
So
yeah.
Because when the game was competitive, he made some very impactful plays.
Right.
I had a coach I'm pretty friendly with from the defense side of football saying that 3 pressures for a game is really good. 7 isn't doesn't happen.
Yeah.
As Andrew said, he looked fresh. I mean, we outlined his issues last year with the leg. Some teams told us that he was dragging that leg that was surgically repaired. When he was in high school. But Andrew, what I find interesting is about Hurts. Jeff and I all week were concerned about Mahomes' back-breaking runs. It was Hurts who did it. Like that. Let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
And I know reporters don't. This week you couldn't watch him because it was only the pool reporter. But even the last couple weeks when you guys were able to watch at least the first 20 minutes of practice, do you notice that left knee looked better?
Do I notice what? I'm sorry.
His left knee was better. Do you notice that?
Yes, I did. Just based on his movements, and now you can't gauge a lot because he's not doing any. He's not even running or even jogging to anywhere he needs to go when we're there. But just his movements, you didn't see the hitch when he walked off the field after that playoff game that you're talking about, Adam, when he got the injury. Yeah, I have a video on my X account where you can clearly see that he was, but I didn't think that was going to be a factor, especially with that week that he had in between. I certainly didn't think that there were going to be any ill effects of that or any lingering effects.
How did Dickerson look after the game and Juergens? Those guys had to really fight through some injuries, and we thought Dickerson struggled in the first half. I mean, there were some times that he gave some inside pressures. Yeah. He looked like he was just gutting it out there.
I thought he looked okay. He was moving around all right. Cam Jurgens looked a little bit more like he was laboring a little bit by comparison,
Really?
especially in the third and fourth quarter. It was very obvious to me watching him walk to and from the sideline. I actually had a really good view of the sideline, so you're able to see the substitutions and players being worked on and so on. And I just saw that he looked like he was going through it and sort of battling through some of the lingering effects of that back issue. At least that's what it looked like to me.
So, to me, guys, I'm going to ask Andrew this first. In your career covering the National Football League and just following it as you do, could you go into the recesses of your mind and find a better coaching job from assistant coach than Vic Fangio? I can't. Other than maybe Stout for this team, but anyone you could think of you come across in your career.
No, I think that was an all-time performance that he had. And if you were able to vote for an assistant coach for a game MVP, Vic Fangio would be my pick. I think everything he's done this season, Adam, has been nothing short of spectacular. To get the youngest defense in the NFL to buy into your ideologies and your principles, that's not easy to do. Just ask the Miami Dolphins. And they bought in, and when you see their success, he's a demanding coach. He's authoritative. He has a commanding presence about him, but there's no gray area. And players know where they stand. Whereas last season, you have two defensive – it was just a murky situation. And there was a lot of players not necessarily knowing where they stood. That's not the case with Vic. And I just think that what he's been able to do and putting his fingerprints and revitalizing that defense has been nothing short of excellent.
Jeff, anyone in your mind, in your career that you've seen?
I mean,
it's a tough one, I know. But
that's tough. I mean, if you want to go to Dan Quinn, the job he did with the Seahawks, was it Dan Quinn? Was he the coordinator?
He was the coordinator, yeah, he was.
Gus Bradley?
Legion of Boom. Yeah,
I thought it was it's either Dan or Gus. Yeah, either one of those two. Because a lot of those guys were not first round pick. Richard Sherman wasn't a first round pick. Cam Chancellor wasn't a first round pick. Bobby Wagner wasn't.
Brandon Browner, I think, wasn't drafted. If I'm not remembering that
Michael
right.
Bennett wasn't a first round pick. Cliff Averill wasn't. I mean, that was an amazing defense for a lot of guys who were not first rounders, and they were dominant too. But I mean, you could put this defense up there with any one of them. So
he did all this with like a 3-man rotation at edge rusher. They were really lean there all season long. They had a young defensive backfield. I mean, to take it a step further, I think the job that he and his assistant coaches have done deserves a lot more praise than maybe it's getting nationally, because I mean that's not an easy feat. 2 young corners that you're relying heavily on, a safety in C.J. Gardner-Johnson who's banged up a lot and he's sort of enigmatic and you don't really know what you're going to get from him. Zach Bond, Nakobe Dean. I mean, there's questions across the board.
Yeah. So Bryce Huff, by the way, was he in the locker room after the game? Did anybody sort of try to ask him like what it was like? What did you observe?
He was smoking a cigar. He looked like having a good time. He won a championship. It's everybody was happy. I didn't get the sense that he was bummed that he didn't play or anything like that. Now, when I did speak to him on Thursday, he'd mentioned to me when I sat down with him, he mentioned, I don't know how many snaps I'm going to play. That's the way that he worded it. I don't know how many snaps I'm going to play on Sunday. And that to me, my journalistic antenna raised, and I was like, might not be active this week.
Well, Adam and I were trying to figure that out. And, we were going through this live in a podcast, and we were saying, if they're going to activate Brandon Graham, there's not too many other areas where they're just going to want to take a guy from. And I remember saying, they might deactivate Bryce Huff, but then by the end of the show, I convinced myself that's impossible, because what if Nolan Smith were to get hurt or Josh Sweat were to get hurt? Then you'd have to have Brandon Graham play way more snaps than I think budgeted for, but they did it anyway.
He played 13 snaps. And the way that my mind works, like I already had my inactive list typed out like hours before the game, the night before. I was like, these are the guys that aren't going to play. Even when they activated Graham, like I had that story already written. I know Graham was going to go. Nick Gates would probably be the guy, and I knew they were going to elevate Blasingame and Morrow. I try to always do the roster gymnastics in my head, at least what I think makes sense and how the Eagles would think. And so I wasn't really surprised. There was nowhere else to pull from. Huff was only playing a snap or two. So when he told me, I don't know how many snaps I'm going to play, I was like, well, you only played like 1 or 2 the week before. Probably not going to be active. That was my first inclination. So there it is.
Crazy.
One more thing I want to ask you, and I know Becton got hurt, and we'll learn more in the coming weeks about Tyler Steen, whether he's going to be the answer at right guard. But when you look at you take an overview, we know they have a decent amount of free agents, but Jeff and I were talking about this. They still have a really good core of this football team. where do you put this team going forward here about what they can be over the next few years?
That's a great question. I think Howie Roseman has put the Eagles in a position to be contenders for the foreseeable future. Now, that's not to say they're going to have a home run offseason like he had last year. I just don't think that's going to be feasible. But there's a lot of young developmental pieces in place here that are going to continue to grow with the Eagles. Sometimes you're a victim of your own success and you lose critical coaches like down the line. Maybe some assistant coaches aren't going to be there, but they have pieces there that I think made monumental leaps from year to year that they can count on moving forward. And Vic Fangio is going to probably be in place. He'll probably coach there as long as he wants to. I guess the big question there is just how do they fulfill a potential need at offensive coordinator, and you kind of go from there. But I think that they've really assembled this roster to be a pretty formidable force for the foreseeable future.
Did you happen to see Jake Elliott? I mean,
I did.
Concerns. He must have been the happiest guy in the world.
He was having a good time.
I imagine so. Is there a scene that will always stick in your mind from inside that locker room that wasn't an obvious one or hasn't been out on social media yet? Anything that really jumps out to you?
Probably the one where Brandon Graham's FaceTime and Jason Peters, and he's talking to Jalen Hurts.
Oh, nice.
I'm the one. I took that photo. Jalen Hurts lighting up a cigar at his locker.
Mm-hmm.
Howie Roseman dancing in the scrum with those guys.
Was Gilly there?
What's that?
Gilly
was not. I didn't see him.
Okay.
I didn't see him in there.
Funny.
All right.
Yeah, it's just certain moments from there. Players that I've covered closely all season that I'm just going over to and congratulating on their success. Just moments like that. It was when you sit back and reflect on it. I'm sure there's some that I'm not thinking of. But right now, the Brandon Graham one and seeing how elated Slay was and perhaps his final game as an Eagle was something pretty cool too.
By the way, what time were you done work?
I left there about, I guess it would have been like 1:30 at home. It was 12:30. And I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to call it. I had to do a pregame call, and I didn't, I was getting late. And then I wanted to get back to the hotel and get some sleep because I went to the day after press conference with Nick Sirianni and Jalen Hurts as well. So, yeah, it was they had some shuttle buses there at the Superdome, so it was nice to get in and out. I think that they did it as about as an efficient job as they could have.
Did you feel like Jalen has been in his post-game podium and the day after today's MVP thing a little bit more introspective, a little more giving of his thoughts and his emotions the last the 48 hours?
Yeah, but he's in front of a national audience as well. So I think sometimes you're able to turn it on a little bit more, knowing that there's more eyes on you. If it were a local setting, who knows? That's not to say that he wouldn't.
Good point.
But he did reach the pinnacle of what every athlete strives for in his profession. So sometimes that kind of opens your eyes to different things and reinforces it or serves as confirmation of some of your beliefs and ideologies that you kind of are so headstrong with. And I don't know. I think that he gave some really good answers today. And sometimes you kind of it puts things into perspective when you finally achieve what you've been searching for, what you've been working for. And he loosened up a little bit. He seemed a little bit looser, but the way that he's wired, he's going to want to get back after it and try to get the next one. His mindset's always going to be let's worry about the next one. But they're going to enjoy this. Everybody really enjoyed this. But I thought that Jalen handled that really well and seemed to he seemed to enjoy himself.
Andrew, people throw around the word or the phrase dynasty, and I'm not big on that, but they are an elite football team. There's no question about it with everything that they have, the coaching, the players, and the front office, by the way. To me, with this thing, and we'll talk more about free agency down the line here, but I would throw this back to you, and we have to see how, obviously, what happens with other teams in free agency, draft, and trades, and so forth. But could you see them back next year in this game?
No, only because it's difficult. I could sit here right now and say, yeah, that was such a dominant performance, and tell you, yeah, but I don't think that would be being truthful. To without taking everything into account, knowing that you could be losing you're going to lose your offensive coordinator, injuries broke right. There's a lot of things that went really well for the Eagles in terms of them also growing as a team, and Jalen Hurts evolving, Nick Sirianni evolving, but a lot of things have to break right for you too. as a football team. So for me to sit here and say, yeah, they'll be back, or believe in that, I don't think that would be really responsible on my part.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, when I think it's fair to say this, going into 2025, yes, they'll have moves to make, but they'll be, just for what they have already that is under contract, they'll be looked at with the Lions, probably Washington, now, and maybe the Packers still, because the Packers will add. They'll be among the 3 or 4 teams that are favored to come out of the NFC. Now,
yeah, and they should.
Whether that happens and whether they get the breaks, yeah. I mean, we all thought this about them last year. Then they're 10-1, and then they completely implode. So yeah, there's a lot of.
Yeah, well, they should be viewed like that. They're going to be a competitive team for the foreseeable future. Like we talked about, they have a lot of young pieces in place that are going to continue to improve. Mm-hmm. Like you said, sometimes it just comes down to, I don't want to say luck, but it comes down to certain things going your way, health and certain things. Like there's always a team that surfaces that no one's talking about that makes a run, or just you never know. There's a whole multitude of things that can kind of throw a wrench into those plans of getting there. There's a reason why not a lot of teams have done that. The Kansas City Chiefs were sort of a rarity in that sense, but look, they're going to be a really good team as long as their marquee players stay healthy.
All right, great stuff. Hey, I remember I saw some scenes of what Bourbon Street looked like before the game. I can only imagine what it looked like after. It probably still looks like that right now.
That's a place that I want to know parts of, man. I get a little claustrophobic. It's too many. If you can't move, it doesn't need to. That's not a place that I need to be. It doesn't seem like a good time for me, or even a place where I can report and do some scene setting stories. I can see it just fine on TV.
There you go.
One question for you before we get out of here. Where was the best meal that you got? What restaurant or what was the best meal? Where?
Oh, that's awesome. I would say Surrey's. It was a place called Surreys. It was actually recommended to me by C.J. Gardner-Johnson's trainer, Patrick Robertson, and it was a breakfast place. I went with Dan Gelson, Martin Frank, and Ed Kratz, and I had shrimp and grits, which was recommended to me, the best shrimp and grits. They also have the spiced iced coffee, which was phenomenal as well.
Ooh, nice.
That's the place. That's the first place I'm going to next time I get back.
Nice.
Well, awesome. Well, have a safe trip back. We thank you so much. You didn't do a good job in New Orleans. You did an elite job. You were fantastic. And
thank you.
Both your podcasts and, of course, your coverage on InsideTheBirds.com. And don't take too much of a break because we're about to turn the page into getting to a very, very active offseason. So get back soon, all right? Get back healthy.
I'll get back, and then the first week of March, I'm going to try and go someplace warm.
Nice.
All right, guys.
Well, I guess not Indianapolis. Indianapolis first week of March, buddy. You might have to wait till the second week of March.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Well, March 2nd.
There you go. Sounds good.
All right, Brandon.
All right, guys.
DiCecco.
Appreciate it. Talk to you guys soon.
For Andrew DiCecco and Adam Kaplan, I'm Geoff Mosher. You've been watching the day after Super Bowl LIX show on Inside the Birds.